Chicago Bears players are going a little bit overlooked in fantasy football because the team isn't projected to win a ton of games this season. But that doesn't mean their players can't be productive for your fantasy football team.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their prize pick projections, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's prizepicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. On the show today, we look at how the Chicago Bears players stack up for fantasy football. The players worth picking up for your team, the players worth taking a flyer on in deeper leagues, and the guys that maybe you should avoid and let other fantasy football players in your league take on with your knowledge of the Bears, helping you know a little bit better than what they're going with entering in your league's drafts. I think it's got to start first and foremost with Justin Fields. Everything starts with Justin Fields this season. And I think when it comes to him in fantasy football, it's a different conversation than what we're expecting in the regular season for the Bears team as a whole. Because so much of what we've talked about for expectations and for measuring the team's success this season, for Matt Eberflus and the Bears, it's not going to be necessarily about how many yards Fields throws or how many touchdowns he throws, but really the type of development he makes, the progress he shows, his ability to grow as a football player within this offense, regardless of what that actually results in for the team. For Fields this season, it's much more about process than results. This team as a whole is going to be more about process as results, which then makes the fantasy football conversation more difficult for a quarterback like Justin Fields, because he could take steps forward and show us a lot of progress, but not ultimately end up being a super productive quarterback, because so much of that feels like it's going to be at least somewhat reliant on his supporting cast. And as a fantasy football quarterback with Justin Fields, that ends up being more of what you're banking on. You're not banking as much on will Justin Fields be a decent quarterback this season, but it's will his offensive line give him enough time to throw to produce the way you want him to as a fantasy quarterback? Will his receivers not only get open for him, but then make the catch and also make plays after the catch to expand his production as a quarterback? And more importantly, also, will the Bears offense be able to finish drives with touchdowns? How much will they be running the ball? How much will they be running the ball in the red zone and at the goal line and handing it off up the middle, as opposed to Fields getting the passing touchdowns himself? Although, of course, there's an opportunity for him to get touchdowns with his legs, which are always going to be a boost there. But it leaves a lot of unknowns trying to sort out Justin Fields. And I think among all of the Bears' fantasy football options this season, he might be the biggest unknown, or perhaps the one with the largest range of outcomes. Because you could see an outcome where he has a great season. Not 5,000 yards, great, but 3,500 plus yards and a good, couple dozen touchdowns and low interceptions, and finishes as a highly productive fantasy quarterback. I mean, no one's on here pretending like he's going to be, a top 5 fantasy quarterback all season and be that big time difference maker for your football team. I mean, you're looking at Fields as, either a later QB1 or more likely, a QB2 type option. But, you throw him in, you see how the season goes at first, but more so you kind of throw him in against some of the better matchups on your schedule. If you don't have a quarterback that is your go-to every week starter, you can look at the games that the Bears are playing and say, yeah, you know what? Against the Texans in week 3, probably going to be an opportunity for Fields to score some fantasy points. Maybe the Giants in week 4, but then, the Lions, they play the Falcons, the Jets. Maybe even the Eagles by that point in the season. We'll see how good and bad they are at that point. But there can be some spots where Fields steps up and can be a productive player. But I think it's also important to remember that in spite of how much bad there was on the Bears offense last season in terms of the pass-catching talent not playing up to its standards, except for Darnell Mooney, and the coaching staff and the play calling really kind of struggling around them, and the offensive line still kind of coming together, the running game still coming together. In the last 4 games that Justin Fields started and finished, so if you remove the games where he was injured or left the game injured halfway through, but the games where he was healthy, started the game and finished the game, which was 4 out of his last 5 games that he actually played in, he finished as a top 12 quarterback in each of those 4 games in the Matt Nagy circumstances of last season. So that's not to say he's going to come into this season and be a top 10 quarterback every single week, week in and week out, but it does speak to his ability to still be able to produce in a combination of his legs and his arms from a fantasy quarterback situation, even when things are going terribly in the last regime. And we expect, as we saw in the last preseason game, the play calling should be improved. We'll see about the offensive line and the wide receiver talent, but at least some better coaching around him comparatively. And in theory, can't get too much worse than what we saw supporting cast-wise offensively this upcoming season, but it is still volatile. It still is a little bit unknown, and it's hard to go full in on investing on Fields as your fantasy quarterback. But if you can get him late, if you can get a good value on him, there is a ceiling there that you feel like maybe, just maybe, that last preseason game against the Browns especially showed you what this offense is capable of when everything does come together. And there should be at least moments and flashes and games of that this season that you can take advantage of with your fantasy quarterback. The other big question on this Bears team is how this running back committee / backfield is going to play out. Is it going to be a committee with Montgomery and Herbert? How much production can we expect for Herbert or for Montgomery? Everyone seems to be expecting that number to come down. We'll kind of look closer at this Bears backfield and how we might see that split this season in Chicago next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at PrizePicks, and they're here to make your Sundays even more fun this season with a better way to do daily fantasy. Here's how it works. You pick 2 to 5 players, and if they and you decide if they'll go score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, and then you can win up to 10 times your money back on any entry. So you can bet on David Montgomery having over 850 rushing yards this season. You can bet on Justin Fields having over 3,300 passing yards this season. You're not competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. PrizePicks offers projections on any sport you watch. It includes the NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, golf, college football, college basketball, soccer, esports, NASCAR, tennis, you name it. They've got it at PrizePicks. Entries can be made in just 60 seconds or less. It's super easy. It's safe. They offer super fast withdrawals, and it's currently operational in over 30 states and Canada. Download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 when you enter in our promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. You deposit $50, they'll give you $50. Don't forget to enter in our promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. We don't have a great sense yet of how the Bears will split carries in this backfield with David Montgomery and Khalil Herbert. Last season, when Montgomery was hurt, we saw Herbert come in and play really, really well for a 6th-round rookie, to the point where we're not positive that David Montgomery will be a Chicago Bear after this season because he will be a free agent this upcoming year. And if Herbert and the other running backs in this depth chart can show them enough to say, yeah, we don't want to pay David Montgomery top running back money, that's where you start to get these concerns about, well, what kind of production will David Montgomery be able to have this season? And we don't have a great sense of what that'll look like. I think for the most part, we project based on, okay, this is an outside zone offensive system with Luke Getsy coming from the floor system and the Shanahan system, stretching runs vertically and then being able to cut back off of that. And David Montgomery, through his time at Iowa State and early with the Bears, has long been an inside zone running back that still offers the cutback options, but is more downhill and get ahead of steam first and cut back off of that. And that's not to say that then David Montgomery can't be successful in a primarily outside zone scheme. We've seen when the Bears have run outside zone plays before in the Matt Nagy offense that David Montgomery has been able to have success with them. The bigger question is, will the Bears commit to David Montgomery and want to invest in David Montgomery in this scheme that isn't necessarily what he has done maybe best or been most comfortable with through his Bears career? It does seem, though, like they'll at least give him the opportunities to do so and to show what he can do. And that's part of this season-long evaluation process that we're seeing from this new Bears coaching staff. But the contrast there is that Khalil Herbert has looked more comfortable as that sort of stretch zone runner. And that seems to be a slightly better fit for his skill set than it is for David Montgomery's. And so as the season goes on, does Herbert earn a bigger and bigger role? The preseason is never going to be a strong indication of how players are going to get used in the regular season, but it's worth noting that the Bears clearly kept David Montgomery out of the first two preseason games and weren't inclined to use him much in that third preseason game. Got him going on a couple of drives there, and after he broke off a couple of nice runs, they said, all right, good enough. We know you, David Montgomery, are very good and are, at the very least, going to be the lead running back in Chicago. It's just a matter of how much of a lead running back role that is and how many opportunities that Khalil Herbert is going to get then in that backfield. I think it's worth noting, too, that Herbert was kind of getting the first team snaps, of course, when Montgomery wasn't playing in the first two games, but then he wasn't playing like extensively. It wasn't as though the Bears were taking an extra long look at Herbert, like they're trying to figure out whether he's any good or not, or whether they like him or not. It was pretty clearly like they gave Herbert the starting reps with Fields and stuff, but then when that was over, it was all Ebner and Darrington Evans, and they were just trying to see the rest of their depth chart. So, like, obviously they weren't going to push Montgomery out there, but they weren't overdoing it with Herbert like they really wanted to see a ton of him as well. So, all that being said, I think there's room for Herbert or for Montgomery to get his carries. Does that mean he's going to be clearly, easily above and away a 1,200-yard running back this season? Probably not. I mean, in his career, his peak was 1,070 in 2020. And I think last season with the 4 injured missed games due to injury, he picked up 850 yards. I feel like that's about a good number to put him back at. Like, he is going to split some carries with Khalil Herbert and be a little bit less of a true workhorse than he has been in years past. But I think it's premature to full on assume that it's going to be a true like 50-50 running back by committee type thing that's really going to be a split for them. I mean, there's still time for that to change and for the coaching staff to develop sort of favorites in that regard. But it's important to keep in mind that in this preseason, we saw Khalil Herbert and Treston Ebner, more so than everyone else, struggle in pass protection pretty poorly. And that's not to say that David Montgomery is some stud in pass protection, but we were thinking of Herbert as more of a passing down type back and Ebner as more of a passing down back, but you also need to be able to pass block in addition to catch the ball. And Montgomery can catch the ball. And, not that he's a top pass blocker by any means, but if he can separate himself in that area, there's a chance for more snaps on those third down situations. So I think Montgomery will get his carries and still be worth, a top type of running back opportunity. Just a matter of whether or not the touchdowns are going to be his. And that's something I'll be interesting to see, because through the preseason, there was a lot of passing touchdowns in the red zone or outside of the red zone, as was the case for all three of the Bears' passing touchdowns against the Browns. But that was a little bit intentional in the preseason. I think they wanted to see the passing game in that area, as opposed to the running game. It's a little bit more make a big pile at the line of scrimmage and see if your running back can kind of get through. It's a little bit less complicated in some of the same ways, and not something they felt like they needed to show as much. The Bears have stated all along, though, they want to be a run-first team. So I think there should be enough opportunities for Montgomery even if Herbert is going to cut into them somewhat. But I'm not ready to fully invest in Herbert as he's going to cut into so many of Montgomery's carries that he's a top fantasy sleeper running back to keep ahead on, to really get ahead of everybody else on and keep on your roster. Probably not quite so much. And I also think of David Montgomery as probably more of the goal line back. If Herbert's a little bit more of an open space speed guy, but Montgomery is really good at bouncing off of contact and staying low and staying upright. Not that he's the big bruiser, and who knows, maybe they'll go to the fullback Kari Blasingame and he'll poach some goal line touchdowns from the Bears. But I think if you're at the goal line, you're going to hand it off to a running back. It's probably going to be Montgomery over Herbert and Ebner, and that's enough for me to say, yeah, he's definitely still going to be the guy to go to. Understanding that as things go, this coaching staff doesn't have particular loyalty to him, and things could change as the season goes on. I don't think we're expecting too much change in projection. It's a little more certainty in what the Bears have going with their pass catcher situation from a fantasy football perspective, even as the depth chart itself is a little bit murky, and the murkiness of the depth chart answers some of the fantasy football questions for us. We'll look at the Bears pass catchers, and if there's time, we'll sneak over to the defense and special teams as well. Next on Locked On Bears. Are you one of these people that think it's okay to drive stoned? What's the worst that can happen? You end up driving below the speed limit? It's no big deal, right? Wrong. The truth is, your reaction times slow way down when you're high. Not only do you put yourself in danger, but everyone around you. Talk about a buzzkill. Stop kidding yourself. It's not okay to drive high. If you've been using marijuana in any form, do not get behind the wheel of the vehicle. If you feel different, you drive different. Drive high and get a DUI. We know that this Bears passing game is going to flow through Darnell Mooney and then to a lesser extent, Cole Kmet. Everything after that, we can make some educated guesses at, but you're projecting a little bit on, namely Byron Pringle coming back as the presumed wide receiver 2, but having missed the entire preseason and training camp, maybe there'll be some rust there and still some time needed to get on the same page as as Justin Fields and really have that quarterback receiver timing down. And of course, learning the offense as well. So then does that sort of, in the meantime, promote Equanimeous St. Brown as more the number 2 wide receiver option among the group? He does know the offense the best coming from the Luke Getsy system, but he's also a guy who has never really been able to put it all together for consistent regular season production in his career. So is this all of a sudden the season where it's going to click? We can hope for that, but if you're looking at your fantasy team on trying to get the most yards, you're not necessarily looking at that as a surefire investment at the wide receiver position. Velus Jones Jr. could be a lot of fun. A slot guy, a speedster, put him in the backfield as well. Try and throw it to him on the outside and go vertical. He can do a lot of different things, but he is a rookie. He too has missed some real important time to work with Justin Fields and get on the same page. And so, can you count on that to be a significant enough fantasy football producer to be well worth a draft pick? I wouldn't, certainly not in most standard leagues. It's a different conversation if we're talking, dynasty football or some massive league of, 20 teams or whatever it might be. Then maybe there's some boom or bust upside there that if Velus Jones ends up getting some kick return action or just they get the ball to him on some screens, he's one of those guys that feels like he could score a touchdown on any play. So that could be worth a flyer in super, super deep leagues, but you're going to find a lot more options more reliable than him in most sorts of standard type formats. So that's what brings you back to Cole Kmet, who still was able to have 600 yards and 60 catches last season. Not like a top fantasy performer at tight end, but over the course of a season, still finished, I think, in the top 15 there. And we're expecting, at the very least, his fantasy production should improve. I don't know how high his ceiling is going to be in terms of overall production this season, but the main difference being 0 touchdowns last season drastically limited the way he was able to influence fantasy teams and lowered kind of where he finished in a lot of those statistical rankings. Because I think in yards, he was 12th among tight ends, and catches was right up there as well. But the lack of touchdowns hurt him so much. And we can project that fairly confidently he's going to have more than 0. Maybe it's not 10, but it's definitely going to be more than 0. Jimmy Graham's not there to take away your red zone targets. You don't have a lot of consistent big bodies at wide receiver that are going to take away your red zone targets. Yeah, they're still going to run the ball in the red zone. Fields might scramble in for some of them, but we saw 2 touchdowns to tight ends in the last preseason game, one of which was Cole Kmet, although he was wide open on a little bit of a busted coverage there, so not necessarily directly translatable. But we talked before on this podcast a couple weeks ago about how Cole Kmet is really going to be key to what a lot of the Bears want to do on offense this season. Go back and take a listen to that podcast if you haven't heard it already. We're not going to rehash the whole thing because that was a whole Cole Kmet podcast. But so much of this scheme relies on having that number 1 tight end like Kmet that can do a little bit of everything. And that's a great way for him to be able to sort of find his space against the opposing defense. If they respect him as a blocker and a receiver, he can really be a big difference maker for this team if he's able to step up into that bigger role. So I think at the very least, he's getting another 60 catches and 600 yards and definitely more than 0 touchdowns. So he'll be better fantasy production than it was last season. It's just a matter of how much better. You know, I'm not here to say like he's the breakout guy you got to get on your fantasy team just yet, because I wonder if there are physical limitations with him and are just limitations of this offense and the pass protection that there's enough risk there. Like we talk about Fields and his volatility. There's a little bit of that with Cole Kmet's ceiling. I don't think his floor is going to be any lower than it was what we saw last season, but the ceiling there is a little bit to be determined. So a lower end tight end option for you there. But I'm all in on Darnell Mooney as a fantasy wide receiver this season. That if you've got people in your league down on Mooney because, you know, think of the insert your own reasoning and excuses. Allen Robinson's gone. So Darnell Mooney is going to get even more of the attention. And, you know, this Bears offense doesn't have great talent around him, so he's not going to be able to produce the same way. I mean, whatever you want to throw out there about Darnell Mooney, I'm still expecting the same, if not more, from Mooney than what we saw last season. I really think he's almost in a better situation now than he was last season because Allen Robinson isn't there and taking some of the targets there, because he truly can be the go-to option even more often than he was last season. And he revealed that last season he was dealing with a groin injury for much of the year. So he wasn't even fully healthy, and he still had 81 catches for 1,055 yards and 4 touchdowns. I think there's a lot of potential for Mooney to not only produce the exact same amount, if not more, from what we saw, that he can be Fields' go-to guy and that they're going to find ways to get the ball in Darnell Mooney's hands, because he was one of the first players that this Bears coaching staff and front office raved about earlier this offseason, February, March, the earliest press conferences. The player that stood out the most of them, Darnell Mooney. I really think he's going to be the guy they go to. And if you can catch people in your league or in, you know, the world of fantasy football doubting or questioning how productive Darnell Mooney can be this season, even if they just project a little bit of a step back, no. As long as he's healthy, which is sort of the caveat for all things fantasy football projections, as long as he's healthy, big season for Darnell Mooney. I mean, I just don't see enough reason to counter why he would have such a good season. There's just not enough. There's not enough to me that says this is going to fall backwards and not be as productive. That I don't see. I see like the other Bears receivers. They're talking them up and they're saying like, yeah, they can make some plays and stuff. And I think it's more likely that, yeah, like Pringle, Pettis, Velus Jones, Equanimous St. Brown, like maybe they can do enough to keep the offense moving, but none of them are going to do enough to take production away from Darnell Mooney. That's going to be the Darnell Mooney show, and then everyone else gets a little bit here and there to sprinkle around and spread around fairly evenly. Like I wonder if we're not going to see a super clearly established wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3. That, you know, when the season is done and you look at the receiving yards for every Bears player, like it's going to be Mooney up here, and then Cole Kmet probably up there, and then like I'm guessing Pringle, St. Brown, Velus Jones, Pettis, etc. Like those guys may end up being fairly closer in production to where it's hard to separate like who's second, third, and fourth place in receiving yards. There might only be a couple hundred yards between them. Still expect Byron Pringle to be the top of that list, but I just wonder if, say he's got, 600 yards and Velus Jones has 400 yards and Dante Pettis has 300 yards. Like, it's not like he was just clearly far and away worlds better than everyone else. And I couldn't miss St. Brown in there with 400 or 500 yards. It's like, I could see those guys all kind of being in the same type of range. It's not going to be like Mooney with 1,000, Pringle with 800, St. Brown with 400, Velus Jones with 300, right? I think it'll be a little bit more of a murky spot there, which is a way of saying like, yeah, probably avoid non-Darnell Mooney wide receivers in fantasy football. Unless you're in a super deep league, then Pringle's the guy bigger opportunity in Chicago than he's had in Kansas City. Try and see if he can be that lightning in a bottle to step forward. Just wouldn't expect Velus Jones to have the huge breakout season. I think there's flash plays in there. There's an 80-yard touchdown somewhere one week, and if you can get lucky and capture it, that happened to play him that week, great. But I don't know that it's a season-long, big-time production there from him as a Chicago Bears wide receiver. We'll touch briefly on the Bears' defense and special teams. The Bears were super low in interceptions last season. Turnovers as a whole were down. Sacks were pretty high because of Robert Quinn. Given the Bears' emphasis on turnovers, I would bet not only are you going to get a regression to the mean of more turnovers in general, but also more of an emphasis from the coaching staff. I would bet you'd see an uptick in turnovers this season. Points allowed, we'll see. It's going to be a simplified Bears defensive scheme, and I have a feeling there will be times when we'll be frustrated a little bit with the Bears defense, and I don't think it's going to be like a top 5, top 10 defense, but not a bottom 5, bottom 10 defense, but more like middle of the pack type of group. And the return game seems to be pretty wide open. We don't even know exactly who those guys are going to be. Jakeem Grant kind of came out of nowhere last season and made the Bears a pretty formidable special teams, but Richard Hightower, the new special teams coordinator, doesn't have a history of super top-notch special teams. They're fine, but they're not like blowing the world away. So again, I'm not bullish on Bears defense special teams as a potential fantasy option there. If you just need one quick in a quick week, like same kind of thing, fill in against certain teams on the schedule. Play them against the Texans. If you're just like rotating defenses in and week out, play them against the Texans, play them against the Giants, maybe against the Lions, certainly against the Falcons and the Jets, and they can give you some top 10 performances in those games. But over the course of a season, I think there will be times when this Bears defense gets burned a few times and aren't the best choice for your fantasy football team. Hope it helps you sort of get a sense of where these Bears players might fit into your fantasy schedule this season. Certainly, we'll get a sense of where these Bears players fit on the 53-man roster on tomorrow's podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. The 53-man roster deadline is today, Tuesday at 3 o'clock. So, we'll get the initial 53, and then there'll be that 24-hour period of waivers and bringing in new players from the outside team, and then we'll get more like the finalized Week 1 53 a little bit after that. We'll break down all the moves you need for you right here on the podcast. So I hope you'll come back more for that tomorrow. Make Locked On Bears your first listen each and every day here on the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team every day, and that includes your fantasy football team. We talked fantasy on the podcast today. If you want more fantasy football, Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast, host Vinny Iyer has been breaking down fantasy football for 2 decades now, and he can help bring you the moves for your team that no one else in your league is getting. So check out Locked On Fantasy Football when you're done with Locked On Bears, and then come on back tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Bears and another opportunity for you to bear down.